This is Larry Hatcher, and I am delivering part 2 of my lecture on Chapter 15, Psychological Disorders, and Chapter 16, Treatment of Psychological Disorders. In part 1, I ended somewhere in the vicinity of page 7. I want to make sure that everybody in my class is looking at the correct set of lecture notes, so we're going to go back to our title page and show that. We're looking at the set of lecture notes. Page 1 is headed Chapter 15, Behavioral Disorders, Chapter 16, Treatment of Behavioral Disorders. During part 1 of my video, we got as far as page 6. Had been lecturing on depression, among other things. On page 7, I indicated there's 2 forms of depression: dysthymia, which is an ongoing persistent depressive disorder, major versus major depressive disorder, which is an intense form of depression that's usually in response to a difficult life event. At the end of part 1, I was just about to begin a new section headed Types of Psychotherapy that are particularly effective in treating depression. So let's go there. I'm at the bottom of page 7. Types of psychotherapy particularly effective in treating depression. Meta-analyses have been done investigating the effectiveness of different psychological treatments in treating different kinds of psychological disorders. The big picture is that most of the schools of psychotherapy that are widely used today are effective in treating most psychological disorders. There's indication that some kinds of therapy might be particularly effective in treating particular psychological disorders, and when there is a distinction like that, I'll try to say a few things about it in my lecture. There's a lot of research that indicates that a kind of therapy that's particularly effective in treating depression is the family of therapies called cognitive therapies, things like rational emotive therapy. Beck's cognitive therapy. It might surprise you to hear that a cognitive therapy would be helpful here. We think of depression as being an emotional disorder. Wouldn't they want to have some kind of emotionally based treatment for it? Well, a lot of researchers believe that at the core of depression is disordered, self-defeating thinking. You have a negative way of thinking about yourself. You have a negative way of thinking about the world. If we can change your cognition so that you think more positively about yourself in the world, that should make you less depressed. That should begin to raise your emotions and help you claw your way out of that depression. And there is a lot of research indicating that these treatments are effective in treating depression. So if you suffer from depression, our first choice is going to be some kind of cognitive therapy, such as one of these. Now, that's not the only approach that's used to treat depression. For better or for worse, there are families of antidepressant medications that are used to treat it. I'm on page 8 now, top of page 8. When people suffer from depression, very often the first stop is the family doctor. Ideally, your family doctor will connect you with a therapist that will give you some kind of talking therapy, some kind of cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy to help you. In the meantime, your physician might decide to put you on antidepressant drugs, at least in the short term. There are different kinds of antidepressant medications. Until the late 1980s, the only 2 that were available was a family called the MAO inhibitors and a family called the tricyclics. Both of these medications work by increasing serotonin, norepinephrine levels and activity in the brain. They are effective, but both have side effects. MAO inhibitors, if you're on an MAO inhibitor, you do have to be careful about the other medications that you take so you don't trigger an interaction. Tricyclics, and a lot of people will get a little bit sleepy during the day when they're on tricyclics, and they may not like that. Because of the side effects associated with these drugs, pharmaceutical corporations have been searching for something that would treat depression but not have the side effects. And in 1988, they hit pay dirt with Prozac. Prozac is medication that was the first widely available member of a whole new family of antidepressant medications. Prozac is a member of the family called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Nobody wants to say that again and again. So your family doctor will probably refer to it as an SSRI. I'm going to put you on an SSRI. Prozac is now among the best-selling of all prescription medications, and it was just the first member of the family. Zoloft is a member of the same family. Luvox is a member of the same family. These medications have been valued in their treatment of depression because they are effective and they tend to have fewer side effects than the older medications. Although they're effective and popular and widely prescribed, they are controversial for a number of reasons. Among other things, if you're placed on Prozac or one of its cousins, you'll probably see among the warnings that come with the medication is that this medication might increase your inclination to have thoughts about committing suicide. That is one of the concerns when people are put on Prozac. Needless to say, most people that are put on these medications don't commit suicide or even think about doing it. But it is one of the warnings that you will receive when you're put on these medications. I've been talking about depression and different kinds of depression. We're now going to talk about one of the first cousins to depression, a psychological disorder called bipolar disorder. It's an interesting disorder in that it involves alternating between two different psychological states. Bipolar disorder involves swings between depression and mania. In fact, that's why it's called bipolar disorder. Depression is one pole, mania is the other. The typical person with bipolar disorder will spend some period of time displaying the symptoms of depression, as I've described earlier, and then spend a different period of time displaying a different psychological condition called mania. Mania is a disorder in which the person is overly excited and hyperactive. When people are in the manic phase, they tend to be very talkative. There's a stereotype that if you're in the manic phase, that means that you're very happy and you are manic and exhilarated about how wonderful life is. And that is the way that people sometimes will display this manic phase, but it doesn't necessarily have to involve happiness. The most obvious characteristic of this phase is being very excited, having a lot of energy, being very hyperactive, and being talkative. Bipolar disorder seems to have a strong biological component, tends to run in families. When we do fMRI scans of the brain of the individual suffering from bipolar disorder will show one profile of characteristics when they're in the depressed state, a different profile of characteristics when they're in the manic state. As is the case with a lot of the psychological disorders that has a strong biological component, it can be treated with medication. Medication is not the only thing that's used to treat bipolar disorder, but it's on the list of things that are likely to be done for the individual. One of the first treatments that were available for bipolar disorder was lithium salts. It's an interesting treatment in that when somebody suffers from bipolar disorder, you might think that they would need two different medications. You might think they would need some kind of antidepressant to bring them out of their depression, and maybe they need some kind of a tranquilizer to bring them down from the mania, but not so. One treatment, lithium, if it's administered at the right point in their cycle, will both bring them up from the depressed state, calm them down from the manic state. They'll go into these states less frequently, and when they do go into them, they're less extreme. Lithium salts for a long time has been used in treating bipolar disorder. At this point, I want you to watch a short 5-minute video called What is Depression? I'd like to show this video because it makes some points beyond the points I made in my lecture, provides general information about depression, goes over the symptoms of depression, and going beyond what I talked about, it identifies specific brain areas that are affected by depression. There are areas of your brain that actually get smaller if you've been depressed for a long period of time, and it talks about treatments for depression. As is always the case, I want you to bear a couple of questions in mind as we watch this. Question 1, what are the two areas of the brain that get smaller when a person suffers from depression? And question 2, does asking someone whether they're having suicidal thoughts typically increase or decrease the risk of actually committing suicide? You might have a friend that you think is depressed, and you might be worried that your friend is thinking about suicide, but you're concerned, will I just plant the seed of that idea in their mind if I ask them about it? In the video, they talk about research that's addressed this issue. I have a link here that will take you to the video. As I said before, I don't like to embed these videos inside my video because I get in copyright trouble with YouTube. If you're using a Windows computer, you can control-click this link. It'll take you right to the video. Do watch it, look for the answers to my questions, and then we'll pick up after you've seen the video. Let's assume you have watched the video and you have found the answers to my questions. Here's what I saw. Question 1, what are the two areas of the brain that actually get smaller when the person suffers from depression? The frontal lobes and the hippocampus. Neither of these areas should surprise us. Frontal lobes, you'll remember, among other things, are involved in planning, decision-making. When a person is depressed, very often they report that they are indecisive, they can't concentrate, they don't know what to do. No surprise that the frontal lobes, which is in part responsible for that kind of ability, would be getting smaller with depression. Hippocampus is one of the older areas of the brain that's important in regulation of emotion. No surprise that it is affected by depression. Question 2, does asking someone whether they are having suicidal thoughts typically increase or decrease the risk of committing suicide? Bulk of the research indicates it decreases the risk. You might be afraid to ask your friend if they're thinking about suicide because you're afraid you might plant the idea in their mind. But if your friend has been depressed for a while, they have probably thought about suicide. It's one of their ways of ending their suffering. Needless to say, most people who suffer from depression don't commit suicide, but you don't need to worry that you're going to plant a seed. This person's probably been thinking about it already, and they'll be relieved that someone's taken enough interest in them that they've asked them about their thoughts. We move on to that very topic. I'm on page 11, and our new topic is suicide. In this part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the suicide rate. What's the prevalence of suicide? How many people kill themselves per 100,000 people per year? And has the suicide rate changed over time? Are there sex differences in suicide? Is one gender more likely than the other to commit suicide? What are the demographic characteristics of those that commit suicide? What about social and personality traits? And what are the warning signs of suicide? This lecture, in addition to leading to the usual multiple choice questions you could expect on our upcoming multiple choice quiz, it's also going to result in a small group discussion exercise and also a written test. Let's go ahead and look at our small group discussion exercise questions. So we have these questions in mind as I go through my lecture, and you'll be formulating your own answers to these questions. On page 12 of the lecture notes, exercise on suicide. You'll do this after I've lectured on the topic, and by then you'll have the ammunition you need to answer the questions. Question 1. List some steps that this university could take to decrease the suicide rate among its students. This could be things done by the administration, things done by faculty, or things done by students. Some possible areas: how might we identify at-risk students? What kind of interventions in therapy might we use? We've identified people that are at risk for suicide. What could we do about it? And prevention. How might we change things so that people are less likely to think about suicide in the first place? There's one condition, and you've probably already guessed what that's going to be. Any recommendation you make must be based on research findings that I presented in class when I lectured on suicide. You can make more than one recommendation if you like. Part one is describe something that could be done to decrease the suicide rate. And part two, question two, is where your points are really going to be when I grade this written test. Clearly describe 2 research findings that led to your recommendations. This must be research findings I presented in class when I lectured on suicide. You need a total of only 2 research findings, regardless of how many recommendations you made. We will do this small group discussion exercise after I've lectured on my concepts and research findings related to suicide, which will be coming up next. I'm at the bottom of page 12 now, and this is a good place to end this video. Be aware that there's more lecturing to follow. Look for the link that'll take you to part 3 of my lecture on psychological disorders and treatments for psychological disorders.